The Application Life Cycle Risk Management Podcast, Episode 13, IDisposable Confusion. I'm planning to get my MCSD certification next, and the first exam I plan to take is the 7483, which will test my knowledge of C#. To study, I got this free PDF off the web, which I wouldn't recommend, but I haven't found anything yet that I would recommend, so this one I'll have to do. In this book, on Chapter 5, and in other places on the web, it makes this statement. If a class contains no managed resources and no unmanaged resources, it doesn't need to implement IDisposable or have a destructor. If the class has only managed resources, it should implement IDisposable, but it doesn't need a destructor. When the destructor executes, you can't be sure managed objects still exist, so you can't call their dispose method anyway. 3. If the class has only unmanaged resources, it needs to implement IDisposable and needs a destructor in case the program doesn't call dispose. The dispose method must be safe to run more than once. You can achieve that by using a variable to keep track of whether it has been run before. The dispose method should free both unmanaged and managed resources. The destructor should free only unmanaged resources. When the destructor executes, you can't be sure unmanaged objects still exist, so you can't call their dispose method anyway. After freeing resources, the destructor should call GC suppress finalize so the object can skip the finalization queue. So what's the difference between a managed resource and an unmanaged resource? An unmanaged resource is something that is not under the direct control of the .NET Memory Manager. So file handles, connection to the database, memory handles, and other OS items fall under the realm of unmanaged. Managed code is everything else. So if you read the points above and read the statements about managed resources, you would think, or you should think, that's already under the control of the .NET Memory Manager, so I shouldn't have to do anything. But with one little tweak, this all becomes clear. What this block of text is talking about specifically is managed code that is referencing other code that implements IDisposable. So, let's rephrase the block of text to the following. If a class contains no managed resources that implement IDisposable and no unmanaged resources, it doesn't need to implement IDisposable or have a destructor. If the class has only managed resources that reference resources that implement IDisposable, it should implement IDisposable, but it doesn't need a destructor. If the class has only unmanaged resources, it needs to implement IDisposable and it needs a destructor in case the program doesn't call dispose. The dispose method must be safe to run more than once. You can achieve that by using a variable. The dispose method should free both managed resources that implement IDisposable and unmanaged resources. The destructor should free only unmanaged resources. After freeing resources, the destructor should call GC suppress finalize. Now there is one other situation where you might want to implement IDisposable on a class that doesn't reference an object that implements IDisposable. And while this particular case is rare, I think it's probably a good idea to list it here for completeness. If you have a class that will consume a lot of memory, either directly or indirectly, you might want to consider implementing IDisposable and the dispose method so that any class that is calling this method has a way of immediately releasing the memory the class is using by dereferencing the memory it is using, and then calling GC collect, GC wait for pending finalizers, GC collect. Now I can already hear some of you saying, but you shouldn't have to ever need to do this. And yes, 99% of the time you shouldn't. But if you have an issue with this, talk to the guys over at the Microsoft Virtual Academy where I learned this. For other links, check out my blog at blog.dmbcllc.com.